A world number 4 tennis player just admitted something that makes no sense on paper. He said he wanted to feel what it is like to stand next to a woman ranked 18 spots below him on a completely different tour. Not to coach her, not to promote her, just to feel it. Sit with that for a second. Felix Auger-Aliassime has beaten Novak Djokovic. He has walked out onto center court at Wimbledon with royalty watching. This is not a man who needs to borrow anyone's spotlight. And yet at the 2026 US Open, he chose to pair up in mixed doubles with a 21-year-old from the Philippines named Alex Eala. When reporters asked him why, he did not talk about her forehand. He talked about something he called the Eala Effect. Is that just a nice quote for the cameras? Or is something real happening around this player that most casual fans have not caught on to yet? Here is what makes it stranger. The match itself was a disaster. Eala and Auger-Aliassime lost in 39 minutes, outplayed and eliminated almost before the crowd had settled into their seats. By every normal measure, this pairing should already be forgotten. It is not. Clips from that match are still circulating, her name is still trending, and the man who lost alongside her is still talking about the experience like something in him actually shifted. That is the paradox at the center of this story. A losing result, a rising obsession, both happening at the exact same time around the exact same 21-year-old. By the end of this video, you will understand what the Eala Effect really is, why a top 4 player named it out loud, and why this afternoon at the US Open might be remembered as the start of something much bigger than one doubles match. But first, you need to know who Alex Eala actually is. 10 months ago, most American fans could not have picked her out of a lineup. She was a name buried in the lower half of the WTA rankings, known mostly to the die-hard fans who track qualifying rounds at 6 in the morning. She picked up a racket at age 4, growing up in a country that had never, not once, produced a top 20 women's singles player. Over 100 million people, and until this year, not a single one had cracked the top 20. She rose through the juniors and won the US Open Junior Girls Singles title in 2022. For most players, that is the peak, and then a slow fade into the tour's deep midfield forever. The gap between beating 16-year-olds and beating Iga Swiatek is enormous, and most careers quietly die inside that gap. Eala's did not. In 2025, she reached the Miami Open quarterfinals, the first Filipino ever to do it. This year, she won the Washington Open, her first WTA Tour title, beating a string of players who had reached Grand Slam finals or lived inside the top 10. That run pushed her to world number 18, the highest ranking any Southeast Asian woman has ever reached. Here is why that number matters, even if you have never watched her play a single point. Rankings in this sport are brutally honest. You cannot talk your way to 18 in the world. You have to beat real opponents, on real surfaces, under real pressure, again and again. When someone from a country with zero tennis infrastructure breaks into the top 20, that is not luck. That is seismic. And this is exactly the kind of story that explodes once the right spotlight finds it. Which brings us back to Auger-Aliassime. Elite athletes do not spend a Grand Slam appearance on sentiment. If he wanted this experience badly enough to say it out loud to reporters, the effect around Eala was already alive in the locker room, long before it reached the headlines. If this is the part where you leaned in a little closer, that is exactly the kind of story we chase here before the big networks catch up. Staying subscribed is how you keep catching moments like this early instead of 6 months late, because the ranking is still just the surface. What actually pulled that comment out of Auger-Aliassime runs deeper than a number 18 next to her name. Here is the first layer, and you can see it with your own eyes if you know where to look. Watch the crowd. At the Miami Open, Eala walked out for an early round match against a player ranked far above her. By every normal logic, the stands should have been half empty. Instead, entire sections were packed with fans waving Philippine flags, chanting her name between points, sounding a lot more like a soccer stadium than a tennis court. Why would a stadium fill up for an unseeded player in an early round when half those fans could not have named her ranking a week earlier? Then Washington happened. When she won her first title there, organizers saw a real spike in walk-up ticket sales tied to her matches specifically, something that almost never happens for a player outside the top 10. Filipino-American communities in the DC area started organizing watch groups. If this were just one small, loud group of loyal fans, would tournament organizers actually adjust their own logistics around her matches? Because that is exactly what happened in Toronto. During a 7-match winning streak at the National Bank Open, the size of her assigned courts quietly kept increasing round by round. Schedulers do not upgrade court assignments out of sentiment. They do it based on projected attendance. This is the point where the story stops being about one enthusiastic fan base and starts looking like a measurable trend. Filipino-American communities span this entire country, one of the largest diaspora populations in the United States, and until this year, they had almost nobody in professional tennis to rally behind. No man, no woman, nobody inside the top 100. Then suddenly there was someone, and that community did not show up quietly. They showed up loud, in numbers, inside a sport that has historically struggled to reach far beyond a fairly narrow slice of the American audience. If an entirely new fan base is filling seats because of one player, what happens to that fan base if she keeps climbing instead of leveling off? This is usually where most observers stop looking. Loud fans, flags, a proud community. Feel good, but easy to file away in a box labeled cultural pride. But that box does not explain why a top 4 ATP player, someone who has never once needed to borrow attention in his career, would go looking for this exact experience. Crowds cheering for an underdog is one thing. Elite athletes rearranging their own choices around another player's momentum is something else entirely. That happens at a level most fans never see, inside the locker rooms, inside the quiet conversations athletes have with each other far away from any camera. Here is the assumption almost everyone makes, and it is wrong. Everyone assumes the Eala Effect is about fans, crowds, flags, ticket sales. That is the easiest version to see from the outside. Now flip it around. What if the fans are not the effect at all? What if they are just the symptom and the real effect is happening between the players themselves? Think about who Auger-Aliassime actually is. A man who has played through hostile crowds in Australia, adoring crowds at home in Canada, deafening crowds at Wimbledon. If crowd noise alone explained his comment, it would not have been worth mentioning. Top players deal with loud crowds constantly, so why single this one out? Why give it a name at all? Here is the twist. What he was describing was never about volume. It was about direction. In most mixed doubles pairings at a Grand Slam, attention flows toward the bigger name. Fans show up for the ATP star, and the WTA partner becomes the supporting act. That is exactly how it went for him. In every previous year, he skipped mixed doubles entirely because there was no reason to bother. This time, the attention did not flow toward him. It flowed toward her. Think about what that means for a player at his level. He has spent his entire career being the reason people tune in. And for one afternoon, he stepped onto the court as the supporting act to a 21-year-old from a country with zero tennis history, and instead of that feeling uncomfortable, he called it an opportunity. He wanted to feel it before it slipped away. That is not a story about fans falling for an underdog. That is a story about elite athletes recognizing gravity the second they feel it. Attention in this sport is never just emotional. It is economic. It is sponsorship value, it is broadcast priority, it is the invisible currency that decides who gets the featured court and who gets buried on an outer field. And Auger-Aliassime was standing directly next to someone whose gravitational pull was starting to rival his own. Here is the piece that reframes everything. Around that same window, Eala was announced as the newest global ambassador for Panasonic Philippines. Not a small regional deal, a major brand building an international campaign around her rise. Brands do not do that because of a loud stadium section. They do it because their own internal data is telling them the exact same thing tournament schedulers already saw in Toronto. Attention is moving toward this player faster than her ranking alone would predict. So the Eala Effect was never really about a fan base cheering louder than expected. It is about a shift in where value flows inside a sport that is normally rigid about hierarchy. Number 4 is supposed to outrank number 18 in every measurable way, every single time. And yet here was the number 4 player in the world, publicly admitting he wanted a piece of what the number 18 player already had. That should not happen. In tennis, it almost never does. But saying it out loud is one thing. Does the evidence actually back it up? Start with the match itself. That first round loss to Gael Monfils and Alina Svitolina, a real-life married couple, 4-1, 4-1 in just 39 minutes. On paper, a forgettable blowout. Instead, it generated more coverage than several quarterfinals happening on the same day at the same tournament. Reuters covered it, the Associated Press covered it, Canadian outlets covered it because of Auger-Aliassime, and Filipino outlets tracked every point like it was a final. A first-round doubles loss should never pull that many newsrooms into treating it like a major story. Second piece of evidence. Compare her media footprint to players ranked right around her. Players between 18 and 25 typically generate a fairly predictable, modest amount of coverage. Eala's numbers simply do not fit that pattern. She is pulling attention closer to a top 5 player, not someone sitting at 18. That gap between her ranking and her visibility might be the clearest fingerprint of the effect Auger-Aliassime named. And look at how packed her US Open schedule actually is. Mixed doubles, the stars of the Open exhibition alongside her close friend and rival Eva Jovic. And for the first time in her career, entering the singles main draw as a seeded player, 3 high-visibility commitments stacked into the exact same window. Scheduling at a Grand Slam is a deliberate exercise in maximizing eyes on the players expected to draw them, and the US Open put Eala everywhere this year. That only happens when the people running the tournament already believe the effect is real. Which brings us back to the question this video opened with: why would a top 4 ATP player publicly admit he wanted to feel something borrowed from a player ranked 18 spots below him? Now you have the answer. He was describing something that organizers, sponsors, and international media had already been reacting to before he ever said a word. The crowds in Miami, the ticket spikes in Washington, the court upgrades in Toronto, the Panasonic deal, the stacked schedule in New York. Every piece of evidence points in the same direction, and Auger-Aliassime simply became the first person with a big enough microphone to say the quiet part out loud. Here is the last detail that ties it all together. Eala's singles draw at this US Open sets up a potential 4th-round meeting with Coco Gauff, a 2-time Grand Slam champion and the biggest homegrown star American tennis has right now. If the effect around Eala is even half as real as the evidence suggests, that match would not simply be a tennis match. It would be a genuine collision of 2 different gravitational pulls, on American soil, in front of an American crowd that has never had to choose between rooting for its own star and getting swept up in someone else's rise. That is not a hypothetical anymore. That could actually happen in the next 2 weeks. So what is the Eala effect, and why did a top 4 player feel the need to name it? The answer is simpler than it first sounds, and bigger at the same time. It was never about one loud fan base or one polite quote for the cameras. It is about attention moving faster than a ranking can keep pace with, and elite athletes noticing that shift before the rest of the world catches up. Auger-Aliassime did not create the Eala effect by naming it. He just happened to be standing close enough to feel it first, and honest enough to say so. Alex Eala is 21 years old, currently ranked 18 in the world, and every piece of evidence here points to a player whose real influence has already outgrown that number. Sponsors are already treating her like a top 5 name, tournaments are already scheduling her like a headliner. The only thing that has not caught up yet is the ranking itself, and rankings in this sport have a strange way of eventually catching up to reality. Which means the real story might not be behind us, it might be about to begin. Somewhere in this draw sits a potential 4th-round match between Eala and Coco Gauff, playing in front of her own home crowd against a player whose pull with that same American audience keeps growing every week. If that match happens, it will not just be a tennis match. It will be the first real test of whether the Eala effect can survive contact with the biggest star American tennis has. Nobody knows yet how that test ends. But if you want to be watching the moment it does, this is exactly the kind of story we break down the second it happens, before the headlines catch up. Staying subscribed means you find out first, not a week late. Because right now, there is one question worth sitting with. What happens to an effect like this the moment it finally meets something big enough to push back?